Imagine a cold so complete it steals the breath from your lungs. A cold where the only sound is the flat, dead crunch of your boots on frozen mud. This was the Dakota Territory in the winter of 1878, a land that had long since given up pretending to be anything other than hostile. For a man who answered to no name, it was just another Tuesday. He'd ridden into the miserable collection of sodden timber and false fronts they called Redemption Gulch for whiskey and bullets, in that order. The town huddled under a sky the color of old iron, the wind a constant whining thief that stripped away any hint of warmth. He was a tall man, built of angles and necessity, his face a road map of hard miles and harder fights, partially obscured by a thick beard frosted with his own breath. A long gray duster, stained with the ghosts of 100 campfires, fell to the tops of his worn leather boots. The Colt at his hip was not an ornament, it was a tool, as much a part of him as the calluses on his hands. He wanted nothing from this town but his supplies, and to be gone before the next snow sealed the pass. But the splash of red against the unforgiving white of the street was something new, something that didn't belong. It was a color too vibrant, too alive for a place like this, a place that specialized in grinding all color down to shades of brown and gray. He stopped, his hand resting on the neck of his weary horse, and stared. She was sitting in the thin, dirty snow packed against the wall of the general store, her back pressed to the rough-hewn planks. She couldn't have been more than 20. Her hair was the color of polished jet, a stark black against the impossible porcelain of her skin. But it was the dress that held his gaze. It was a cheongsam, a garment of dark red silk that flowed over her slight frame, its intricate pattern dulled by dirt and travel. It was a dress made for perfumed gardens and moonlit evenings in a land half a world away, not for the raw, bleeding edge of the American frontier. And her feet, tucked beneath the hem of that impossible dress, were bare. They were blue with cold, resting directly on the frozen ground. The sight was so profoundly wrong it registered in his gut like a physical blow. He wasn't a man given to charity, or even to noticing the plight of others. Survival was a solitary business. You either had the grit for it, or you died. It was the simplest, truest law of the wild. Yet he couldn't move. He watched as townsfolk gave her a wide berth, their gazes sliding past her as if she were a ghost, a piece of unpleasantness to be ignored. This was more than just poverty. This was exile. He let out a slow, frosty breath, cursing himself for the feeling that was coiling inside him. It wasn't pity. It was a professional's annoyance at such a flagrant disregard for the rules of staying alive. Nobody sat barefoot in the snow unless they had already decided to die. He swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning in the cold. His spurs made no sound in the packed snow as he walked towards her. He moved with a quiet economy, a man who wasted no motion and no words. He stopped a few feet away, a looming shadow in the bleak afternoon light. She didn't look up, her gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance only she could see. He fished in his pocket, his gloved fingers finding the familiar weight of a few heavy coins. He held them out. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble, rough as unsanded pine. For boots and bread. The coins were meant to be the end of the transaction, the end of his involvement, a simple, impersonal offering to satisfy the unwelcome knot in his stomach so he could go about his business. For a long moment she didn't move. He thought perhaps she hadn't understood or hadn't even heard him. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her face was fine-boned, elegant, but smudged with dirt and etched with a weariness that went far beyond her years. Her eyes, though, were what struck him. They were dark, almond-shaped, and in their depths a fire burned, a stubborn, defiant flame that had no business existing in a body so clearly surrendering to the cold. She looked from his weathered face to the coins in his hand, and then back to his eyes. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her expression. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, with an educated cadence that was as out of place as her silk dress. "I don't need charity," she said, her words perfectly formed, without a trace of an accent. "Just work." The man went still. Of all the things he had expected, this was not one of them. He had seen desperation in 1,000 forms, had seen men beg, steal, and kill for less than what he offered. But this was pride. A pride so fierce and unyielding it bordered on madness. It was the kind of pride that got you killed twice as fast in a land that fed on the weak. He was stunned into silence, the coin suddenly feeling foolishly heavy in his palm. He almost turned and walked away. It was not his problem. He had made the offer, she had refused. The ledger was balanced. He could get his whiskey and ride on, and the splash of red in the snow would be a memory that faded with the next mile. But he didn't. Her words echoed in his mind, lodging there like a burr under a saddle blanket. Just work. It was a demand, not a plea. He looked around the desolate street. The blacksmith was a notorious drunk, likely passed out by his forge. The stable hands were boys who could barely muck a stall properly. There was always work to be done, but not for someone like her. Not for a foreigner, a woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a suicidal amount of pride. His gaze fell on his own gear, the worn straps of his saddlebags, the fraying blanket roll. An idea, unwelcome and impractical, took root. He had a small line shack a few miles out of town, a place he used as a way station on his trapping routes. It was little more than a dirt-floored hovel, but it was sturdy and likely infested with mice and neglect. "I have a cabin," he heard himself say, the words feeling foreign in his own mouth. "Needs to be cleaned, wood stacked, supplies sorted." He laid out the terms, his voice flat and transactional. "You do the work to my satisfaction, you get a roof, food from my stores, and $1 silver. Fair?" She watched him, her dark eyes searching his face, looking for the catch, the trick. She found none, just a cold, pragmatic offer. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Fair." He gestured with his head towards the general store. "I'll buy you boots and a loaf of bread. It comes out of the $1. "Agreed," she said without hesitation. It was a business arrangement, not a rescue. This distinction seemed important to them both. He watched as she rose to her feet, a slow, stiff movement. As she did, the sleeve of her dress slipped down, and for a fleeting second he saw it, a dark, ugly mark on the delicate skin of her inner wrist. It was a brand, intricate and cruel, the kind used to mark livestock. He had seen marks like it before, on cattle pushed up the Chisholm Trail. He had never seen one on a human being. The sight sent a chill through him colder than the wind. This wasn't just a lost girl. This was property that had escaped. He said nothing, filing the image away as he led her into the store, the bell above the door jangling a shrill, cheerless welcome. The ride to the shack was a trial by ice. The wind had picked up, a physical force that tore at them, carrying fine, sharp pellets of snow that stung any exposed skin. He rode his big roan, Jericho, who leaned into the gale with stoic endurance. The girl walked beside the horse, her new stiff boots crunching in the snow. He had offered to let her ride behind him, but she had refused with a quiet shake of her head. She would not be carried like a sack of flour. She matched the horse's pace, her head bowed against the wind, one hand holding the thin silk of her dress from whipping into her face. He watched her from the corner of his eye. She never stumbled, never complained. Her resilience was a silent, unnerving thing. He had known hardened men, veterans of war and long cattle drives, who would have been whining an hour ago. She just kept moving, a small, determined figure in a world of overwhelming, brutal white. By the time they reached the cabin, the light was failing, the sky bruising to a deep, threatening purple. The shack was half buried in a drift of snow, a dark shape against the pines. Inside it was frigid, the air stale and smelling of old wood smoke and mouse droppings. It was a miserable place, but it was shelter from the wind. Without a word, he set about building a fire in the small stone hearth, while she, just as silently, found the old broom in the corner and began to sweep the dirt floor with fierce, methodical strokes. The fire caught, spitting and hissing as it consumed the dry kindling, slowly pushing back the aggressive cold. The small space filled with a flickering golden light. He put a pot of coffee on to boil over the flames, the rich, bitter smell a welcome comfort. He watched her work. She moved with a strange, contained grace, her motions efficient and precise. She stacked his spare tins of beans and salted pork into neat rows, folded his spare blankets, and wiped down the single dusty table. There was a discipline in her movements that spoke of a life far removed from this wilderness. He found himself studying the curve of her neck, the determined set of her jaw, the way the firelight caught the red threads of her dress. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with the things they weren't saying. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice startling in the quiet. She paused, her back to him. "Lynn," she said simply. She offered nothing more, and he didn't press. He offered no name in return. He was just the man who had given her a job. He poured 2 cups of coffee into 10 mugs and handed one to her. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, and the fleeting contact was like a spark in the frozen air. They drank in silence, the shared warmth in the tiny cabin a strange and unexpected form of intimacy. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone, and the feeling was deeply unsettling. What he did not yet know was that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one she had brought with her. That night, the snow came in earnest. It was a full-blown blizzard, a howling white fury that erased the world beyond the cabin walls. The wind shrieked through the pines like a banshee, and snow piled in great soft drifts against the door and the single small window. They were trapped, sealed together in their tiny ark of timber and stone. The fire was their only anchor, a living, breathing thing in the heart of the storm. In the wavering firelight, he saw the brand on her wrist again as she reached for another piece of wood. This time he got a clear look. It was a stylized dragon, its coils forming the initials S.V. His blood ran cold. Sterling Vance, the railroad baron, a man who bought and sold politicians like cattle, whose ambition was carving a steel empire across the plains. Vance was known for many things: his wealth, his power, his utter ruthlessness. He was also known for his appetites and for the brutal, ironclad contracts he used to import Chinese laborers who were little more than slaves. He looked at Lynn, at her delicate features and the unmistakable signs of a refined upbringing, and he knew. "That brand," he said, his voice low and even, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. "That's Sterling Vance's mark." She froze, her hand hovering over the woodpile. She slowly pulled her sleeve down, a gesture of instinctual concealment, but it was too late. She met his gaze across the hearth, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a weary resignation. She had been running for a long time. "He bought me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She told him then, not everything, but enough. She wasn't a laborer brought over to lay track. She was from a good family in Guangdong, a family that had fallen on hard times. She was sold, presented as a gift to Vance from a powerful Tong leader in San Francisco, a human token to seal a business deal. She was educated, taught English, music, and art, She was meant to be an ornament for his private rail car, a beautiful, exotic pet property. She had escaped during a train transfer in Cheyenne, slipping away in the chaos. She had been making her way north ever since, trying to disappear into the vast, empty spaces of the frontier. The gunslinger listened, his face an unreadable mask. Every word she spoke deepened the hole he had dug for himself. This wasn't some petty crime. Sterling Vance was not a man who tolerated losing anything that belonged to him. He would have men out looking for her. Not lawmen, but private hunters. Men who operated outside the law, who were paid for results, not methods. He looked at the girl, Lynn, huddled in her worn silk dress, and understood that the stakes of their simple transaction had just escalated from $1 silver to his own life. The blizzard raging outside was no longer the greatest threat they faced. The storm held them captive for 2 full days. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, to the circle of warmth cast by the fire. The enforced proximity should have been a strain, but instead a strange and quiet rhythm developed between them. They spoke, but not of the past that haunted them. They talked of small, immediate things. He told her how to tell different types of animal tracks in the snow. She described the taste of fruits he had never heard of from a home she would never see again. The conversations were islands of normalcy in a sea of unspoken danger. One afternoon, she noticed a long, L-shaped tear in the sleeve of his duster, a memento from a disagreement with a barbed wire fence. Without a word, she produced a small sewing kit from a hidden pocket in her dress. Using thread she carefully unraveled from an inner seam of the red silk, she began to mend the heavy canvas. He sat and watched her, his coffee forgotten in his hand. Her fingers moved with a deft, practiced skill. The sight of her performing such a simple domestic act on his worn, blood-stained coat was deeply, profoundly moving. It was an act of care, of gentle repair, in a life that had known only violence and decay. He found himself telling her about Jericho, his horse. He spoke of how the roan had saved his life during a flash flood on the Cimarron, of the animal's stubborn intelligence and unwavering loyalty. He hadn't spoken of his affection for the horse to another living soul. It felt like a confession. In turn, she told him her name, Lynn, meant forest or gems in her language. She said it matter-of-factly, but he heard the echo of a life, a family, a world that had been stolen from her. He began to see her not just as a fugitive, but as a person, whole and complex, with a strength that humbled him. As she slept by the fire that night, curled under one of his blankets, the red of her dress looked like a defiant heartbeat against the rustic gloom. A fierce protective instinct rose in him, an emotion he thought had been buried years ago on a battlefield in Shiloh. It was a dangerous, terrifying feeling. For Lynn, this quiet, lethal man was the first person in this new, brutal country who had not looked at her as an object to be used, a burden to be endured, or a mystery to be feared. He had simply seen a person in need of work. The quiet before what came next was the longest silence of their lives. On the 3rd morning, the world was born anew. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a landscape of breathtaking, pristine beauty. The sky was a sharp, painful blue, and the sun on the fresh snow was blinding. But the beauty held a new menace. The clear weather meant travel was possible again, for them and for anyone who might be looking for them. As Jacob, a name he hadn't used in years but one that felt right in his own mind again, was checking on Jericho, he saw them. 3 riders silhouetted against the morning sun on the far ridge. They were not cowboys or trappers. They sat their saddles with the stiff arrogance of men who were paid to inflict violence. They carried repeating rifles across their pommels, and even from this distance he could see their clothes were too fine for this part of the country. He felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Vance's men. He moved without haste, his actions deliberate and controlled. He led Jericho to the rear of the cabin, securing him where he would be shielded from the most likely line of fire. He went back inside, the sudden tension making the air thick and hard to breathe. Lynn was by the hearth, stoking the morning fire. She looked up as he entered, and she saw the truth in his eyes before he said a word. "Riders," he said, his voice flat. "3 of them. They aren't local." He didn't need to say more. Her face paled, but her hands, holding the iron poker, were steady. "They are not here to talk," he continued, checking the action on his Colt, the familiar metallic clicks a grim comfort. He laid out spare cartridges on the small table. "Stay inside. Bar the door. Don't open it for any reason." She met his slate-gray gaze, and her own dark eyes were like polished stone. "I will not be taken back," she said. It was not a plea for protection. It was a vow, a statement of fact that hung in the air between them, as solid and real as the pistol in his hand. He gave her a curt nod of understanding. He took up his position by the single window, his Winchester rifle resting on the sill. He was 1 man against 3, poor odds by any measure. But this was his ground. He knew every tree, every rock, every dip in the terrain. The brilliant, silent snow was no longer a blanket of peace. It was a killing field. The riders came down from the ridge slowly, confidently. They fanned out as they approached the cabin, a classic tactical maneuver. The leader, a thick-set man with a florid face and an expensive fur-collared coat, pulled up about 50 yards out. "Ho, the cabin!" he yelled, his voice carrying clearly in the cold, still air. "We're looking for a piece of property that belongs to Mr. Sterling Vance, a Chinese girl. We have a handsome reward for her return, and no quarrel with whoever is sheltering her." Jacob sighted down the long barrel of the Winchester. He centered the front sight on the silver concho of the man's saddle horn. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was a shocking crack that shattered the morning's peace. The bullet screamed across the snow and splintered the saddle horn, sending fragments of wood and silver flying. The man's horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him. The message was delivered. There would be no negotiation. All 3 men dove for cover, and the air was suddenly filled with the whine of bullets as they returned fire, chewing chunks of wood from the cabin's walls. Jacob moved away from the window, using the solid log walls as his shield. He was patient. He let them waste their ammunition, let them reveal their positions. One of the men, younger and more reckless than the others, decided to try a flanking maneuver, circling wide to get to the back of the cabin. Jacob tracked his progress, waiting for the right moment. But the moment never came. The cabin door, which he had told Lynn to bar, creaked open just a few inches. He saw a flash of dark red. The flanking man, focused on the front of the cabin, rounded the rear corner, his rifle held at the ready. Lynn stepped out from behind the doorframe. She was not holding a weapon. She was holding the heavy cast-iron skillet she'd used to cook their breakfast. With a cry that was more fury than fear, she swung it with all her might. The skillet connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening, wet crunch. He dropped like a stone, his rifle falling silently into a snowdrift. The sudden, brutal intervention gave Jacob the opening he needed. As the leader and the remaining man turned in surprise towards the sound, Jacob stepped out, firing his Colt. His first shot caught the second man in the chest. His second was aimed at the leader, but the man was faster than he looked. He twisted and his own pistol roared. A line of fire tore through Jacob's left shoulder. The pain was a blinding, white-hot flash that buckled his knees. He stumbled but forced himself to stay upright, thumbing the hammer back on his Colt and firing again. This time his aim was true. The leader clutched his stomach, a look of shocked disbelief on his face, before toppling from his horse into the snow. The fight was over, but the silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. Jacob leaned heavily against the cabin wall, his left arm hanging uselessly, blood staining the sleeve of his duster, a dark, shocking crimson against the gray fabric. The world swam at the edges of his vision. The leader of the bounty hunters was not dead. He was crawling, moaning, trying to reach his dropped pistol, which lay half buried in the snow a few feet away. But the scent of fresh blood on the crisp winter air had drawn an older, more patient hunter. From the deep shadows of the timberline, a lone gray wolf emerged. It was a large, gaunt male, its yellow eyes fixed on the wounded man. It moved with a fluid, purposeful grace, its paws making no sound on the snow. A low, menacing growl rumbled in its chest. The crawling man froze, his face a mask of primal terror. He forgot the pistol, forgot the girl, forgot everything but the ancient predator padding silently towards him. Nature, in its profound and brutal indifference, had come to claim its due. The wolf did not hurry. It knew its prey was helpless. Jacob watched, detached, as the final, savage act played out. When it was over, there was only the silence and the snow. Lynn rushed to his side, her face a mess of terror and relief. She saw the blood, the way he was leaning on the wall for support, and her composure finally broke. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She didn't hesitate. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her dark red silk dress. The fragile, beautiful fabric became a field dressing, a banner of survival. Her hands trembled as she pressed the makeshift bandage against his wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. Her touch was firm, desperate. In that moment, standing over the bodies of their attackers in the blood-stained snow, all pretense between them evaporated. Their eyes met, and the world narrowed to the space between them. "I reckon I was," he gritted out, the pain a constant throbbing fire. He looked at her, at the fierce loyalty burning in her eyes, at the smudge of another man's blood on her cheek, and he saw a warrior. He had been a nameless man for a decade, a ghost drifting through the territories. But she deserved more than a ghost. "It's Jacob," he said, the name feeling both strange and right on his tongue. He had finally given her a piece of himself to hold on to. They left Redemption Gulch and the ghosts in the snow behind them. They rode north towards the vast, unclaimed wilderness of Montana, a place where a man like Sterling Vance's reach was shorter, and a man's past could more easily be shed. Jacob's shoulder healed slowly, leaving a puckered, angry scar that mirrored other scars he carried. As they traveled, Lynn traded her tattered red Cheongsam for a practical suit of buckskin, but she kept a small, carefully folded square of the red silk, a tangible reminder of the day their lives had become irrevocably entwined. They found a small, forgotten valley nestled by a river that ran clear and cold from the mountains. There, they built a life. The first small cabin they raised was little more than the lion shack where they had weathered the blizzard, but it was theirs. It was a home. They rarely spoke of the violence that had forged their bond. They didn't need to. Their understanding existed in the quiet spaces between words, in the shared labor of building a life from nothing, in the way he would watch her tend her small garden, or the way she would have a hot cup of coffee ready for him when he came in from checking his trap lines. Their peace was a hard-earned, fragile thing, but it was real. One evening, as the setting sun painted the high peaks in hues of orange and purple, they sat on the porch of their cabin. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in her own. He did not pull away. His fingers curled around hers, a simple, profound gesture of acceptance. He had spent years believing solitude was his only sanctuary, the only defense against a world that took everything. But in this quiet woman, with eyes that held the memory of fire, he had found something more valuable than safety. He had found a reason. And Lynn, who had been bought and sold and hunted as property, had finally found a place where she was not owned, but cherished. A place where she was not a survivor, but a partner. Their story is a quiet testament to the fact that sometimes, in the most unforgiving corners of the world, the greatest strength isn't found in a fast horse or a quick gun, but in the simple, unbreakable courage of a hand reaching for another in the dark. Their journey reminds us that in the harshest landscapes, the most resilient thing that can grow is a bond forged in mutual respect and shared survival. If you found the story of Jacob and Lynn as powerful as I did, show your support by pressing that like button and share it with someone who appreciates a tale of true frontier grit. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell for more stories from the untamed West. In a story full of courageous acts, what do you think was the bravest thing Lynn did? Was it refusing charity, fighting for her life, or learning to trust again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.